Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Well, first, I'm glad you're holding this hearing. It's a very interesting issue that I think brings into focus the broader narrative that Mr. Haas spoke about. One of the things that's happening in this country that's led to some of this turmoil and vibrant debate in this political cycle has been that the world has changed dramatically. I mean, that we used to be a national economy, and to some extent still are, but we're deeply impacted more than ever before by global currents. Global markets, what's happening halfway around the world. Foreign policy is economic policy more today than it has ever been. I think someone used the statistic, 5% of the world. We're 5% of the world population, 40% of its economy, but 5% of the world's population. And the good news is that there's millions of people around the world that were once starving who now buy things, and they want to buy things from us and trade with us and travel. This is an extraordinary development. It's a positive, but it has implications. And it's one of the things that's been so disruptive in the political debate, is that we no longer fully control everything that happens in our economy because so much of it is tied to something that happened in some remote place halfway around the world. And the debt is a part of that. The second is this issue of debt. Look, if we were any other country looking at these numbers, we'd be in a debt crisis. The reason why we're not is because the world still has confidence in America, because they believe Winston Churchill's statement that Americans always get it right after they've tried everything else first. And they believe we'll ultimately get this right, and we'll always pay our bills, and we'll get this straightened out. So the stability of our political process and its ability to solve problems has implications on this as well. And I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know how this could be a question that the debt is not an issue, because if you think about what happened to Greece, if that were the United States, or what's happening in Puerto Rico as a territory happened to the broader country, the world would freak out. I don't know if there's a scientific term for that, but I can just tell you the world would flip out if this, the most important and indispensable nation, were to have a debt crisis that would call into question its ability to pay its bills. It would have dramatic global implications. And so this is a major issue. I would also say that you don't run up an $18 trillion debt with one party. This is a bipartisan debt. People say there's no bipartisanship in Washington. There most certainly is. There's an $18 trillion debt to prove it. Both parties have had control at different times, and they have written checks that they couldn't cash, and we're facing the consequences of that. But part of this debate has led us to this point, and I think Senator Flake alluded to it when he talked about foreign aid. This concept somehow that if only we did less around the world, we could take care of this issue. Foreign aid is the one I always hear about. When I explain to people, I think it's 1% of our budget, maybe I think it may be even less. People always use foreign aid. If we just cut foreign aid, we can pay for it, and you fill in the blank, and it just doesn't add up. But we never talk about the costs of not engaging in the world beyond foreign aid. So now you basically have someone, I don't want to get into all that stuff, let me just say you have a major voice in American politics today saying, we can save a bunch of money, let's just get out of NATO. We could save a bunch of money, let's just get out of our relationship with Japan and South Korea and put them in charge of their own security. And I guess what I'd ask both of you to comment on is, what would the world look like for America? Let me just back up one more point. I don't mean to take up all this time because I want you to be able to answer this, but part of this economic growth that we've benefited from would have never happened had the U.S. not helped Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War, would have never happened had there not been a NATO, would have never happened had there not been a U.S. supporting South Korea for all those years, where South Korea's economy at one point, and I believe as late as the 70s, was smaller than the North Korean economy. And then today they're the 9th largest economy in the world, I believe, and they are a contributor to foreign aid. They are a donor, not a recipient. Japan is another successful story, a nation we went to war with and then helped rebuild, and today is one of our strongest alliances in the world. So my question is, what would the world look like now? What opportunities would we not have? Because none of this growth that we've had up to now would have been possible without those relationships and without that stability. What would the world look like economically and ultimately for our ability to pay our debts long term if America were to walk away from its security agreements with Japan, with South Korea, and with NATO? And I know each of these are separate. And I'll add, and let me close with this just to be clear that I'm on the record. Japan, I think South Korea this year will contribute $800 billion to
in Japan as
well. And defense. The Japanese have stepped up in what they are doing in the collective self-defense capabilities. And of course, NATO needs to be repurposed and modernized to face new threats, but the truth is they're an indispensable part of U.S. role in the world. So what are the economic costs and ultimately the impact on our ability to pay off the debt if the United States alliance with NATO, South Korea, and Japan is called into question?
Let me just say,
I would predict that any near-term savings would be overwhelmed by medium-term and long-term costs. It would be penny wise and pound foolish. One is your basic premise, Senator, is right, which is there's been an enormous economic dividend of global stability. If one looks at the last 75 years, the relative absence of great power conflict compared to the previous century has been a tremendous advantage for ourselves and others. The fact that you didn't have proliferation by Japan, which I think would have changed the entire dynamic of Japanese-Chinese relations. The fact that the Cold War ended peacefully and ended in the way it did, with NATO and the West winning and the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union essentially losing. That all created the conditions for the extraordinary economic success of these decades. I understand that economics feeds into security, but security is even more of a prerequisite, I would argue, for economic success. So I think calculations of our quote-unquote savings, even if the host nation support and offsets you mentioned didn't exist, I think are way too pinched. I think it ignores the larger historical truth and the dynamics that if we were to do less, others will do more. And that I think it would probably be more than the circuits diplomatically could handle. I don't want to see Europe get interesting again. I don't want to see the Asia Pacific get real interesting. The part of the world that's all too interesting is the Middle East. And that is the part of the world where the United States is now doing appreciably less than it's done in recent history. And that ought to be something of a strategic warning to us. When we are not prepared to play a significant role, the vacuum tends to get filled by others who are going to have agendas that may be very, very different from our own. So yes, it costs us 3.5% of GDP to do what we do in the name of national security, defense, plus intelligence and so forth. I think it's a bargain. It is a bargain given the strategic and economic benefits, and I think we have to understand it and we have to explain it.
I would just add to that. I mean, I completely agree with Ambassador Haas. I would just add perhaps to make it a tad more pointed. I mean, withdrawing from NATO, creating deep insecurity, military insecurity in the Asia-Pacific region could have devastating economic impacts at any given point. I mean, the reality is that the United States deeply benefits, as does the global economy, but does deeply benefit from stability in Europe and in Asia. Asia is a growing source of growth. The United States is still the strongest area of growth, but these are areas in which having that sense, that security blanket, keeps real disruption at bay. And the idea that we would withdraw, particularly from the Asia-Pacific region at a time where China is at least taking actions that are hard to explain, seems to me to create deep economic challenges over the next several decades. And in terms of issues that we would have to deal with, I say again, you know, I think there is broader agreement on addressing the national debt, but that kind of change would lead to fundamental problems for the U.S. economy, any aspect of the U.S. economy that relates to trade and globalization.
Just my point in asking that question is I want to be clear that doing all these things that I've just mentioned will do nothing to deal with the debt, but would in fact trigger a worsening debt, in my opinion, because of the additional costs that would be imposed on our economy. So, thank you.
Seems like you felt the need to express yourself based on comments you've heard over the course of the last several months.
Not only that, I mean, it's just yeah, sure. But also just kind of seeing the world's reaction to this stuff. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're asking us, is this really going to happen? Or it's having an impact on people's psyche. They're wondering, where's America headed? And I just want to make some reassurance that this isn't going to happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much.